Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 10th chapter in the book of Acts. We made it all the way up till the 23rd verse, which describes 3 of the 4 days which are outlined in this chapter, and the 4th and final day is going to span the range of 24 all to the end, 48. Now, on the first day, we meet Cornelius, who is a centurion. That means he's in charge of Roman military divisions of 100 men in the Italian regiment, but he was a God-fearing Gentile, not quite a Jew, but he was stationed in Palestine, what the Romans called Palestine, the province of, where he would have had exposure to Yahweh, and something in it convinced him and converted him to be a man of prayer, a man of alms, and his good deeds are recognized and received by an angel who visits him, and he tells him to go to or to summon Peter, who is currently in Joppa, and that so he sends 3 men, a trustworthy soldier and 2 of his household servants to that effect. And the fact is that God works through angelic and human mediums. So without the angelic, Cornelius would have no knowledge of who to meet for this important vision that he had. And Peter at this moment in time was located in the port city of Joppa. We find him there at the tail end of the 9th chapter, where he resurrects a woman who was thought dead by the name of Tabitha, Dorcas in the Greek. And so he stays there for a while. He's a guest in the home of Simon, a leather tanner. And he is visited by a vision while in the midst of prayer. The nature of the vision is a sheet of unclean food being brought to him, and the voice encouraging him to slaughter and eat. But Peter, being a devout Jew, says, "No unclean or common things have touched my lips," and he does this 3 times. So he's perplexed by the vision, but it's all going to make sense. And then the same voice of the vision tells him that 3 men are at his door. They are sent from Elohim, and they're going to tell him about Cornelius, that he sent. He had been visited by a vision, and he wants to bring them back to Caesarea. That was the city where Cornelius was stationed. And so they tarry on about for a day, and that's the 3rd day. And now we read the 4th day, the 24th verse, and what lays ahead is the conversion of the first recorded conversion of a Gentile. And the following day they entered into Caesarea, and Cornelius was waiting for them, having called together his relatives and close friends. So not only had Cornelius sent these men at his behalf and on his behest to seek out this man named Peter, who was residing in Joppa, and in preparation for them having done so, he has his family and trusted and close friends gathered for the occasion. So he is summoning them for something significant, which will reveal itself in time. And it came to pass that when Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and bowed before him. Now Cornelius would not have been fully Jewish, so he was ignoring the first commandment of the Decalogue: "Thou shalt not worship any deity or anyone else, any angel, any idol, any human above me." But he knows that this man had something significant to say him. The angel had told him so. He had summoned him, and true enough, he had come. So he's in a state of worship, and this reminds us of the somewhere in the 4th or 5th, or possibly both, chapter of Revelation, where John is worshiping at the foot of an angel who it tells him, "Do not worship me, worship Almighty Elohim." But Peter raised him up, saying, "Stand up, I myself am also a man." So no man should worship any other man. Sadly, the culture of celebrity worship and worship of self, we live in a narcissistic culture that idolizes celebrities, but Peter knew better. He said, I am a man, I am unworthy of worship. I have something to tell you, but please don't treat me as if I am the same being as the Almighty who has summoned me here to you through his angel. And taking with him, he went in and found many who had come together. Remember, Cornelius had summoned his relatives and close friends for the occasion. And he said to them, you know that a Jew is not allowed to associate with or go to one of another's race, but Elohim has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. So the traditional Jewish restriction was to not enter into the home of a Gentile. They were to keep themselves separate and not associate with them. And this we witness in the 18th chapter of John, where the Jews who surrender him to Pilate would not set foot in the door of a Gentile. So they were really missing the bigger picture of the ethical and righteous standard which they should be aspiring for. But Peter, being an observant Jew, he likens, remember, the vision of food. It's not food that he should call common or unclean, but these foods are representative and symbolic of men. So henceforth, Gentiles are clean and declared and seen fit to enter and interchange and converse and associate with Jews. That is why I came about with hesitation when I was sent for. So ask, why have you sent for me? So he knows that he had been summoned. They hadn't given him much details. They could not answer for him on behalf. This is a direct question which can only be answered by him. That's why he's asking it. And Cornelius said, 4 days ago I was fasting until this hour, and at the 9th hour I prayed in my house, and see, a man stood before me in shining garments. This wasn't really a man, it was an angel who take the appearance of human likenesses wherever they appear. And this brings us back to day 1 of Acts 10, and he's fasting, and in response to prayer in the book of Acts, Luke almost always connects visions, which is a revelatory communication of a conscious encounter with a being or a voice of divinity, connects it to prayer. So Cornelius was praying and fasting, and this man appeared to him unexpected, but he didn't quite know what to call it, and said, Cornelius, your prayer has been heard, and your kind deeds were remembered before Elohim. This is a reiteration of what we read in verse 2. His good deeds had sufficiently taken the notice and account of heaven, and that is why the angel had appeared for his sake. Now send to Jaffa and call Simon there, who is also called Peter. He is staying in the house of Simon, a leather tanner, by the sea. When he comes, he shall speak to you. So the angel had only told him a very limited amount of knowledge. He told him to summon this human who is going to explain things more fully. That's the operation of God working through angelic and human mediators. Without the angelic mediator, and this is a double vision, Peter and Cornelius would have no way of knowing or seeking out on his own initiative Peter, who was going to convert him. And had Peter not been visited by the vision, he would not have understood what it meant. The meaning of it would reveal itself in the passage of time 2 days later, when he's at the person who had just told him that he had been instructed by an angel to summon him. So I went to you immediately, and you have done well to come, and now we are all present before Elohim to hear all that you have been commanded by Elohim. So he's thanking him for the prompt response and telling him he did well to come here. And now he's asking that we are all gathered and assembled in the name and in the presence of Elohim to hear what Elohim has to say through him, because he is the leading apostle, the rock of the church, and Paul doesn't really replace him as the human protagonist of Acts until the 13th chapter. So this is still really mostly about Peter. And opening his mouth, Peter said, "Truly, I see that Elohim shows no partiality." This is part of his character. It was embedded in the same Old Testament, which forbade intercourse and association between Jews and Gentiles. It's written in passages such as Deuteronomy 1:17 and 10:17. Elohim shows no partiality or preference or prejudice, in this case related to race. Even though he had chosen the Jews for a people, he was now including the Gentiles in the plan of salvation. But in every nation, he who fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him. So Cornelius was such an example of one who, if he didn't quite technically or fully belong to the Jews, he was certainly a worshiper of Elohim. So he was one from another nation. We don't know where he hailed from. We know that he was in charge of the Italian regiment, so he may have been Italian by ethnic background. But whether Italy or anywhere else, those who worship and fear him and do good deeds are accepted by him, regardless of whether they are circumcised or uncircumcised, whether they are Jew or Gentile. It's all the same to him. Yet he sent the word to the children of Israel, bringing the good news, peace through Yahshua Messiah. He is master of all. So this is the order. The order in which the good news was spread is that it came first to the Jews, who were the chosen people, the descendants of Abraham, many of whom rejected, but the ones who embraced the new faith and recognized the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies became the nucleus of this new religion, which prior to this point has little, if any, Gentile converts in it. Philip evangelized Samaria in chapter 8, so here we witness the beginning of the fourth concentric circle of the Great Commission as outlined in chapter 1, verse 8. Go to Jerusalem, Judah, Samaria, then all the way to the ends of the earth. And the ends of the earth was partly filled in the 8th chapter when a Jewish eunuch who was in Jerusalem to worship encounters Philip, who's also led there by an angel. Angels frequently appear in the book of Acts to minister to him and convert him. And he, even though he was a Jew, he would have spread the good news to Ethiopia. So almost from the beginning, it was a tricontinental movement, and it didn't become European until the 16th chapter of Acts, when Paul evangelizes Philippi, which is the first spread of European Christianity. But even before then, this perhaps native Italian was about to be converted. And the good news is through and is and comes from Yahshua Messiah, who is the master of all. By all, we understand that word to be universal and total, so not just the Jews, but the Gentiles as well. You know that the word came throughout all Judah, beginning from Galilee, after the baptism which John proclaimed. So the word, the messenger of this new message, the good news message, began his ministry in Galilee, and it eventually he spread all the way to Judah. Now the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all follow the same trajectory of his ministry in Galilee, leading him to Jerusalem. But John follows a different narrative. He describes almost exclusively his ministry in Judea. But regardless, it was the baptism, John the Baptist, he was not an innovator of a practice. The Jews invented the right to initiate proselytes or converts into their new faith, to welcome them by baptizing them in the water, symbolically cleansing them of their sin. But what was so scandalous about the way that John did this is he was baptizing birth Jews who had the same need as any Gentile-born person to repent and be reborn and renewed. how how Yahweh anointed Yahshua of Nazareth with the Ruach Kadesh and with power, who went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for Yahweh was with him. We read of the mention of all three members of the triune deity known as Elohim. We read of Yahweh the Father, Yahshua the Son, who was empowered by the Ruach Kadesh, the Spirit, and that it was really, even though the human instrument was the divine Son, it was really all three of them working in tandem and collaboration, because they do not do any work or ministry apart from one another. And he did healings and exorcisms. That was part of his ministry. Other aspects were teaching and preaching. And of course, the ultimate meaning of his ministry was found in the cross. And we are all witnesses of all he did, both in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem, of Judah and in Jerusalem, whom they even killed by hanging on a timber. The apostles, the qualification to be designated an apostle was an eyewitness to the resurrection. We read that John alone was the beloved disciple, aptly named, because he's the only disciple who hadn't fled from fear and visibly witnessed the crucifixion in action. But nevertheless, they were all witnesses to his resurrection, if not necessarily his crucifixion. And not only them, but we read of 500 others whom he appeared to in the 40 days he returned in resurrected form. We read this in 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter. And also Paul himself was visited by the resurrected, already ascended, but returned in resurrected form. That's made him an apostle. Yahweh raised this one up on the third day and let him be seen. So after 3 days, there's the death, the burial, and then the resurrection. For a 3-day period after being killed, he was buried in the ground in a rich man's tomb. Joseph of Arimathea offered him his own tomb, and this was a fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah. He will be buried with the rich, and he was visibly identifiable. He was seen. His passion marks were in him, and he ate food, and he had a tangible body when he returned resurrected. And he commanded not to all the people, but to witnesses, those having been chosen before Elohim, to us who ate and drank with him, and he arose from the dead. So thus who ate and drank with him, the disciples known as the apostles, now that it's the book of Acts, they spent their every day in his 3-year ministry. They were side by side. They ate with him. They drank with him. They slept with him. They lived with him. They ministered with him. They listened to him. They learned from him. And so it was, even though there were 500 total who had seen the resurrected, they too were pre-selected by the providence of Elohim, and they are witnesses of his resurrection, that death did not defeat him, but he defeated death. And he commanded us to proclaim to the people and to witness that it is he who was appointed by Yahweh to be judge of the living and the dead. So one of his roles is to judge the living and the dead. The living are those, eternally speaking, who make it to heaven. Those who are spiritually dead end up in hell. And that authority is given, it belongs to Yahweh, but he shares it as a privilege with the saints. We read of in somewhere in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, I believe. To this one all the prophets bear witness, and through his name everyone believing in him receives forgiveness of sins. So he was the anticipated Messiah, as alluded to by the prophets of the Old Testament. There are too many to list at this present occasion of all the witnesses, but he was the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, and the attainment of forgiveness of sin, which is something everyone needs, everyone wants, is really a simple process. It is believing in him. It's a matter of faith, and if our faith is sincere, we will be forgiven of our sins. While Peter was still speaking these words, the Ruach Hadesh fell upon all those hearing the words. So he was in the midst of preaching, but the Ruach Hadesh interrupted him, and he fell on those all hearing the word. So what happened at Pentecost was coming to these Gentiles in this room. Cornelius was not the only Gentile. Remember, he had gathered his close relatives and close friends. And those of the circumcision who believed were astonished, as many as came with Peter, because the gift of the Ruach Hadesh had been poured out on the Gentiles also. So this would have been a familiar experience to him. After the ascension, for a period of 7 days, they waited, and whilst at the temple celebrating Pentecost, they had received the Ruach Hadesh in a way that they had never experienced before. It made them speak tongues, bridging the language barriers between the Jews from the disparate locations who were gathered at Jerusalem, because Pentecost was one of the 3 Jewish annual holidays where Jews throughout the diaspora were commanded to return to Jerusalem for common and collective worship. But now they're witnessing it coming on Gentiles, and they knew and recognized the experience, and they are astonished at history repeating itself in people they hadn't even considered capable of it. For they were hearing them speaking with tongues and extolling Elohim. Then Peter answered. So the speaking of tongues was one of the witnesses and results of the manifestation of the Ruach Hadesh, which came to them. He bridged the language barriers between the Jews from Libya, from Rome, from Pontus, etc. We read of the full list of the lands from whence they hailed in Acts 2, 9, and 11. Is anyone able to forbid water that these should not be baptized who have received the Ruach Hadesh, even also as we? Now there are 2 types of baptism. There is baptism by immersion that symbolically identifies the baptized in the death, burial, and resurrection of the Savior. But there's also the baptism of the Spirit, which is when we are visited by the Spirit and we are to be filled by it. So the baptism is a more authentic and necessary salvifically for salvation, to be baptized by the Spirit. But now they want to complete and finalize the process. If there's water anywhere, they can immerse them and baptize them and welcome them fully and officially into the new church. And he commanded them to be baptized in the name of Yahshua Messiah. Then they asked him to remain a few days. So he told them there was a source of water somewhere. I don't know if it was in the house or a river outside of the house, but wherever it was, they were baptized, and they were baptized in the name and in the power of Yahshua Messiah. And that wasn't the end of it. There's several days, after which point he stays, and this is going to bleed into the 11th chapter, where Peter tells the Jews of his experience and his knowledge that the good news and salvation has come to the Gentiles, which is going to be shocking and scandalous to many. But we'll pick up on that on a later date. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. Bye-bye. See you then.